The Jesus-timeline, an attempt to reconcile the four Gospels with what we know of actual history. Can this be done? This is a timeline that represents the era approximately when Jesus is said to have lived, between 10 BC and 40 AD, or 40 CE if you prefer. Here are the dates of the political administrations that are featured in the Gospel accounts. King Herod, who died somewhere between late March or early April of 4 BC, Gouverneur Quirinius of Syria, whose administration was between 6 AD and 12 AD, and Pontius Pilate, who was the governor of Judea between 26 AD and 36 AD. Right off the bat, we see a contradiction between Matthew and Luke. Matthew says that King Herod tried to kill baby Jesus by having all the infants around Bethlehem put to the sword, whereas Luke says that Mary was pregnant with Jesus during the administration of Quirinius of Syria. This means that Matthew says that Jesus would have had to have been born at the very latest in 5 BC, if we take the December 25th date seriously as Jesus' birthday, whereas Luke, on the other hand, is saying that Jesus would have had to have been born sometime after 6 AD. Well, let's concentrate on the timeline provided by Luke, because he gives us the most dates to work with. Luke tells us that Jesus was about 30 at the time that he began his ministry. 30 plus 6 is 36. Now, Jesus is said in all three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to have started his ministry after the arrest of John the Baptist. Luke tells us that John the Baptist began his ministry in 29 AD, or in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. He also tells us that Jesus started his ministry after the arrest of John the Baptist, so we must figure that John the Baptist would have been arrested around 36 AD. This is fairly consistent with what we know of secular history, because Josephus tells us in Antiquities of the Jews that John the Baptist was in fact arrested around the time of 36 AD. Luke tells us that John the Baptist was arrested because he was speaking out against Herod Antipas's marriage to his dead brother's widowed wife Herodias. Now, Herod Antipas's brother passed away in 34 AD, so this tells us that we can pretty well rely upon the date of 36 AD as the date that John the Baptist was arrested. So that must be when Jesus began his ministry. So far, it's fairly consistent with what we can reconcile with what we know of secular history, until we ask the question, when was Jesus crucified? Now, since Pontius Pilate was recalled to Rome in 36 AD, this tells us that the very latest date that this could have happened would have been on Good Friday, 36 AD. This means that Jesus would have had at most months, not years, for his ministry. So we cannot reconcile it with John, who says that Jesus' ministry lasted 2 to 3 years. We also can't reconcile it with Matthew, who says that Jesus would have had to have been born 5 BC or earlier. Now, if we assume that Luke is correct, that Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry, and John is correct that Jesus' ministry lasted 2 to 3 years, that means that Matthew is placing the crucifixion of Jesus in 28 AD, 1 year before Luke tells us that John the Baptist started his ministry. Now, Josh McDowell, aware of the contradictions between Matthew and Luke, tries to reconcile the two by telling us that Gouverneur Quirinius of Syria had an earlier administration concurrent with the reign of King Herod. Not only is there no historical evidence to back up this assertion, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, since we know where Quirinius was and he was not the governor of Syria. But letting that go, this would have placed McDowell's Jesus' crucifixion in 26 AD. Not only would this been far too early for John the Baptist, it might have been too early for Pontius Pilate. However, Matthew's gospel can be reconciled with John, even though it can't be with Luke. John provides us with probably the most detailed account of exactly when the crucifixion was. According to John's Gospel in chapter 2, Jesus had his temple tantrum roughly around the beginning of his ministry, in contradiction to the Synoptic Gospels that place his temple tantrum towards the end of his ministry. This temple tantrum would have happened right before Passover in the year 26. The reason we know this is because, according to John in chapter 2 of his Gospel, Jesus has an argument with a Pharisee, where the Pharisee says, "For 46 years was the temple in construction, and in 3 days you will build it up," thinking that Jesus was referring to the actual temple and not his body when he said, "Tear it down, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." Since the temple got started in construction in 20 BC, this tells us that the date for this argument must have been right before the Passover in 26 AD. And since John gives us 3 Passovers in his account, this tells us that John's Jesus was crucified in 28 AD. This was 1 year before Luke tells us that John the Baptist started his ministry, and considerably before Luke would have placed Jesus' crucifixion. Modern apologist Habermas, in a debate with Kenneth Humphreys, however, places the crucifixion of Jesus in 30 AD, and says that Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, where he saw the spectral Jesus, would have been 32 AD, and the creed presented in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is dated to 35 AD, 1 year before Luke tells us that Jesus was arrested and Jesus began his, or that John the Baptist was arrested and that Jesus began his ministry. So my question for the Christians is, how can they reconcile all these contradictions, remembering, of course, that there are no contradictions in the Bible? I now turn the matter over to them, and may God's gift of reason light our way.